we're interested to learn about. It's a bit of a science fiction kind of. It's interesting science fiction for me about space, type 1 civilization. I know there are 3 types of civilizations. Be interesting to learn more. So, and the link with economics. So I'll let you start. Introduce.
Okay. Yeah, Elena, would you go to next slide, please?
Okay, it seems I can't. I can, yeah.
Right. So yes, so we have a bit of an ambitious presentation here, information dense, and centering around a concept called of type 1 civilization. So first I'll introduce the reason we are talking about it in this context, and then we're going to proceed through 3 contradictions in capitalism which pertain to our use of this concept, and then, well, we'll delve deeper into it as it goes on. But I should first delve into what exactly this concept is. So this concept comes from a 1964 paper by Soviet astrophysicist Nikolai Kardashev, and Kardashev was a pioneer in a couple things, but he's most famous in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And he developed this thing called the Kardashev scale as a way of classifying potential alien civilizations based on how much energy they use in terms of, well, in a way that could be measured from Earth, in terms of basically radiation that they generate. And so the scale has 3 stages as he originally proposed it, a type 1 being something like a more advanced Earth level civilization that controls basically all the energy on the planet. You know, whether that's geothermal or the radiation from the sun hitting it. Then there's a type 2 civilization that controls energy at the solar system scale or its local star. And then there's a type 3 civilization which controls its galaxies worth of energy. And he plotted Earth somewhere around 0.7, and that really hasn't changed too much by contemporary estimates. Now, the Kardashev scale, as it was originally formulated, was purely quantitative. And since then, it's been taken up by other people interested in the search for extraterrestrial life. Carl Sagan, the popular scientist, famously, he was probably the one who brought it to mass consciousness after its first popularization. And a number of other scientists have taken it up too, but and added different dimensions to it. Like, well, we shouldn't only think about energy use. We should think about waste production. We should think about information processing. We should think about the degree to which civilizations can modify matter. Can they, make tools that dig pits, or can you modify the quarks and leptons that make up at the quantum level, right? So these are different ways of classing a civilization's sort of advancement. Now, what does this all have to do with anything economic? Well, if we go to the next slide, please. This notion, since its first proposal decades back, has been taken up by futurists. Pictured here, you see Michio Kaku, who's a physicist, I believe, originally, but more famous probably for his popular science writings and futurism. And he's done he was probably the biggest contributor to bringing this concept into mainstream consciousness. And you can see here that he adds a lot of particular qualitative dimensions to the concept of a type 1 civilization. So, he says we can see a type 1 civilization emerging today. The internet is the beginning of a type 1 telephone system. And we can see the beginning of a type 1 economy in the rise of the EU. We can see English as a type 1 language. And he says, local cultures and customs will continue to thrive in thousands of varieties on the earth, but will be superimposed. But superimposed on all of these will be a planetary culture, perhaps dominated by youth culture and commercialism. So this is a very particular view of what a type 1 civilization will be. It's global. It's defined by, free markets. Can we go to the next slide, please? Another futurist, Michael Shermer, who is the founder of Skeptic magazine, among other things. I think he's a science historian is what he calls himself anyways. But so he's really explicit about what a type 1 civilization is for him. He says we need a type 1 polity and economy along with the technology. And this he defines it explicitly as globalism that includes worldwide wireless internet access, digitized knowledge available to everyone, free markets in which anyone can trade without interference from states and governments, and a planet where all states are democracies in which everyone has the franchise. So that is more or less what a type 1 civilization has come to mean as it's mobilized these days. And the real big motivator of this talk, anyways, is that these mainstream futurists are still not a very let's say powerful economic force, but the World Economic Forum is, and one of the reasons why the World Economic Forum is the subject of all sorts of conspiracy theories is they do say some rather radical sounding things, and we interpret a lot of their what they say as basically talking about this contemporary version of type 1 civilization. If you're familiar with their Great Reset program that's generated a lot of conspiracy theory hysteria, it sounds in a lot of formulations strikingly like these particular versions of type 1 civilization. But they talk about it in terms of stakeholder capitalism, where basically all the governments and capitalist organizations need to work together to establish a sort of globalized capitalism that is overcomes the bad sides of capitalism by factoring in things like pollution and this and that. So this is why we think there's an economic connection to this the Soviet means for identifying alien civilizations. Next slide, please. And there is a rational kernel in the World Economic Forum's discourse, right? We think anyhow. There are numerous issues that face the planet today that would benefit from a planetary coordination, or that are arguably beyond the reach of individual corporations or national governments. And the big one here is obviously climate change. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But there's also finite resources that are essential to the planetary, the planet's success, that are in particular areas like the Amazon rainforest. And there are other anthropogenic problems that present planetary level, or that would require planetary level solutions, like space debris, of which there is a shocking amount floating around the planet in near Earth orbit. You can see here, that's how much space debris there is. A lot more than you would expect. And
the satellites potential for collision.
Yes, the satellites and all the debris floating, right? And the potential, if the collisions begin, there is a potential for catastrophic chain reaction that would generate more debris and fragments. And in space, there's no friction, so things move quite fast. And a spare screw can rip through a space shuttle or do whatever. A lot of damage, anyhow. So that's just one example. And the question or the thesis we have is whether a capitalist type 1 civilization could address these problems, as the World Economic Forum and the futurists pose. And our argument, spoiler alert, is that no, it cannot, as we will argue in the following slides. I'll pass over this one for now, and I think pass the torch to Elena.
Yes, thank you for the introduction. I hope so far you have understood why we argue in favor of a type 1 civilization in terms not just of globalization with the meaning we have seen so far, but with this grandiose coordination of resources to tackle these grandiose and urgent problems. So we are saying, before I move to the economics, basically we're saying that Kardashev himself basically recognized that for us to move, or for such civilizations to exist, we need to have got over our inner and inherent limitations, meaning the socioeconomic ones, basically wars, killing each other, or us destroying our own resources, etc., etc. And of course, there has been recent research saying in order for us to reach type 1 civilization, we will need great investment in nuclear fusion and solar power. These are the only kind of powers, not necessarily tidal, not necessarily wind, not necessarily geothermal, but these two can bring us to type 1 levels. Of course, there will be more problems generated by this, such as the heating of the planet, that this also would require a planetary air conditioner or something, or as Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos propose their own version of human being multiplanetary species, or Jeff Bezos says extracting Mars, but Earth to be as a park. So basically they propose type 2 before the completion of type 1. So anything but type 1. So we're going to move now to the assuming there are no questions about the necessity of a type 1 civilization. We're going to move on discussing the contradictions of why capitalism cannot achieve that. So firstly, we focus on 3 of them, that they are the manifestation of the main contradiction: forces of production, basically labor, machinery, raw material, or as neoclassical economics say, labor, capital, blah, blah, versus the relationships of production, the capitalist relationships. One example is that individual ownership, private ownership over the means of production is still legal in most countries. I know it might sound far-fetched right now, why shouldn't it be? But yeah, we'll discuss the problems that ownership, and when I say individual ownership, private ownership, I don't mean personal ownership. I don't mean we should abolish the ownership that I have on my toothbrush or my bed or my car, but I'm talking about the means of production here and nature and all these concentrated resources. Or this contradiction reduces eventually to labor versus capital, all the needs that labor has, labor and the environment that labor resides into, versus capital and capitalism and the needs for capital reproduction. And the 3 manifestations that we think they relate to type 1 future is: 1, the contradiction between nature and human production that needs to be resolved for us to move to type 1, the highly socialized production versus the private appropriation of what the society of workers have produced. And the 3rd is the configuration of technology. So technologies that we see today are not coming from an individual, I don't know, inventors, but they have to be useful in the capitalist economy somehow. So these are the 3 contradictions we're going to discuss. First of all, the nature one. We don't say that capitalism is first of all, we don't agree that capitalism is the best system that we can have. But on the other hand, we compare to feudalism, the past system is probably better for several reasons. So there is a more nuanced relationship than capitalism destroys nature, which to a certain degree does, is that there is a metabolic relationship between capital and nature. So on the one hand, capital subjugates nature by imposing private property on land. So for capitalism to start existing, they had to privatize huge amounts of land by the end of feudalism for capitalism to start existing. So this is one thing that happened in the relationship between capital and nature, versus the ecological sort of role that capital has. What do I mean? Of course, ecological in the most distorted way you can imagine. So the fact that competition, one capital competes with the other, they urge basically each other to reduce costs. And by reducing costs, they reduce the amount of labor they use, the amount of resources they use, the raw material and the machinery. So they try to be kind of economical, not wasteful in the amounts of resources they use in order to produce something. So in that way, the socially necessary labor time, basically how much labor and the related materials is necessary to produce a commodity, forces capitalism to be some sort of ecological, as I said, in the most distorted way ever. So it's a nuanced relationship. That's the point here. So here we can see some of, oops, what have I done? Where am I? No. What happened?
Your slide disappeared.
No, where is
Oh,
it?
it's because we're seeing your screen.
Okay.
There we
Here
go.
Yeah. So basically, these are CO2 emissions since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Europe, excluding 27, is basically the UK. And after the beginning 20th century, probably includes Eastern Europe and Russia. Europe 27 are the red, and the rest is the US. Historically, the CO2 emissions. So what's the question here? The question is, there is one school of thought, one kind of ecological analyst, scholar, whatever, O'Connor, who proposed that there is a second contradiction in capitalism, the one between force of production and relation, but with the conditions of production. Basically, the fact that there are things that are not produced as commodities, but capital treats them as commodities, like nature. And O'Connor says this contradiction is capital specific, and once you resolve this, you can, he doesn't say you move towards type 1 civilization, you have the potential to move. And so this is one perception of some ecologists, a Marxist basically ecologist. Another idea is Moore, who inverts the relationship between appropriation and capitalization. We'll go further into that. Basically, he says that capital tries to appropriate the four chips: food, labor, power, energy, and raw materials, in order to just appropriate, in order to have them under control. But the problem with Moore's analysis is that he treats all these as equal, like neoclassical economics do, by equating equal productive role to labor, equal productive role to capital and raw material and land. And I don't know how many of you have been last year to my presentation with Bruce when we discussed productive and unproductive labor. I cannot go through the whole story why some labor is not productive or why capital is not productive. But yeah, if you have questions, we can discuss this later. But so far, for the time being, you can accept axiomatically that only labor is productive, and the rest, nothing else can basic economically productive, and everything else just needs to be transformed and does not add more value than the one it already has. So the other resources, capital, etc., just transfer their value. They don't add new value like labor does. So one problem of Moore's analysis is this, falls into the trap of neoclassical economics. And the other part is the inverse appropriation of capitalization. What does this mean? It accuses capitalism of being feudalism. Feudalists would just appropriate land, would just conquer land, will take land, not necessarily to trade or use it. And that's the history of feudalism. And the revolutionary nature of capitalism was that they used capitalists used only the things they wanted to capitalize, to make profit of. So basically, Moore says that capitalists do not appropriate in order to capitalize, but they capitalize in order to appropriate. And this kind of perception leads to theories, contemporary theories, of techno-feudalism, eco-feudalism, or proper economic feudalism. Basically, they accuse that capitalism is not proper capitalism, it has become feudalism, and therefore somehow we should reinstate proper capitalism in order to have humanity and nature and everything working well. So in a sense, Moore's theory can be used for scholars, practitioners, etc., support ideas that a better capitalism would do the job. And we add even to lead us to type 1 civilization. But as I said, not all ecological contradictions are capitalist specific. Capitalism, to a certain degree, does not create or destroy the matter energy metabolism, but also the matter energy duality, but does degrade its metabolic reproductive capabilities. So capitalism doesn't want to destroy the environment itself, but it does severely degrading by all these the loss of biodiversity, at least we have seen, and of CO2 emissions and deforestation, etc. So also this implies that there are systems like feudalism in the past, and even the actual existing socialism, like in Soviet Union, for instance, that they were still polluting the environment. It was not in their planning back then. The environment was not an issue yet back in the 70s, at least until the 70s. So to a certain degree, degradation is a capitalist specific feature, and it relates to the first contradiction between labor and capital. So once you resolve this, so degradation should be removed, should be sorted. But contradictions between human economy and nature are not necessarily capitalist specific, as I said. So they're yet to a certain degree inherent in production, and according to Marx, that back then he had already started identifying in the 19th century some environmental issues. He didn't call them environmental. He called something like the degradation of agricultural land by capital or something like that. That was a 19th century ecological problem. So he proposed that for these kind of problems, the metabolic relationship between capital and labor, between capital and nature to be resolved, you need cooperation, and to replace the capitalist private property into social. This is, instead of great reset, I propose a great resist. That's a nice piece of street art here. Now, why are we saying that? Why are we bringing Marx into the equation? Not just because we are Marxists and we're obsessed with him, but of course there are contemporary kind of independent institutes and research suggesting that there has to be a social change in order to meet the temperature goals. For instance, you see this graph. This is from Hamburg Climate Futures Outlook 2023. We have this series of 5 problems at the tail of this phallic-looking shape that cannot be met unless there is a social change, such as the polar ice sheet melt, the Arctic sea ice decline, etc. So Paris Agreement itself cannot be achieved if there is the Paris Agreement goals cannot be achieved unless there is a societal change there, admitted by institutes, research institutes, etc. Not only a guy from 150 years ago. And this brings us to contradiction number 2. So for us, not only to solve the the ecological problem, we also need to solve the economic problem. We still have economic issues that don't bring us to type 1, like unemployment and underemployment. This on its own means underutilization of your planetary resources, having people that do not work. The fact that capitalism cannot even recover properly, so through the falling rate of profits, the fact that we keep having periodic crises, wars, uneven development. So this is example of global unemployment. The last 30 years, basically, it has a tendency to rise. I couldn't find robust global data before the 90s. That's why I have not included them. The rate of profit since the 60s constantly falls. And if we start with data from the 19th century, the global rate of profit has never reached 19th century levels, only when there are wars and conflicts. Here we see historical data on global deaths, conflicts, wars. And although, of course, there were wars and conflicts before capitalism, we see that only when capitalism starts being born, basically, the conflicts become periodical, like the business cycle with ups and downs, and they coincide with the rate of profit. So the least deaths we have, the smallest the rate of profit. So when we have more deaths, immediately a couple of years later, the rates of profit recover. And this is the process, as it's called in political economy, as a rectification. So for every business cycle to be properly recovered and have rates of profit recover, we need a massive world war. And here we see the most deadly century ever was until recently the 20th century. So basically the period that rates of profit could not reach the previous century's levels. Yeah. Of course, in the meantime, this creates uneven development, and we see it in 1 trillion different stats. So some of them are, let's say here, access to electricity. There are still parts of the planet that still don't have access to electricity, and of course to income inequality, some countries being more equal or unequal than others. And this is a pattern that we all know, it's not news to us. So what is the economy then that we propose? We propose an economy that it will be based on a different economic calculation problem, not through the markets, not through individual ownership. So for the above asymmetries and asynchronies to be overcome, we propose economic planning that goes beyond private ownership on the means of production, and therefore competition among individual capitals, and beyond the market-based allocation of resources, like unemployment. So the market needs that amount of employees today, 0 amount of employees tomorrow. So, and all the problems that we know that classical economists call them market imperfections. So how are we going to do that? Are we going to do it with money? Are we going to assign a pricing based on money? Are we going to assign labor units, labor time units for the commodities on nature? Or since we involve nature and not labor is involved in the production and the reproduction of nature, do we need energy units or what kind of indicator do we need in order to design this kind of new economy? And as Gasparato said, economic conceptualizations and actions rely on assumptions regarding what is important to measure and how to measure it. So is it important to measure nature? Is it important to measure labor? Is it important to measure technology? And how are we going to do it? Are we going to do it with the calories that workers consume? Are we going to do it with the amount of energy this machinery has as input and output, the amount of energy that is used and recycled in nature? How are we going to use that? And here it comes the theories of value. There are not only 3, there are probably 23. I've sent before a paper to Ares that summarizes most of them. There's an interesting taxonomy, Lowe and Genovese, very interesting paper. So we isolated 3 of them, 3 of kind of theories of value that relate to a type 1 future. One of them is energy theory of value, basic assigning energy units to when everything is produced, how much energy this computer needs to be produced and how much energy is wasted in the meantime. I think in business or engineering, this has a new name. It's called emergy, but if someone is familiar, you can comment on this later if you want. The other thing that relates to a type 1 future we thought is Moore's law of cheap nature, the 4 chips, as we say, basically to include all these 4 dimensions, nature, labor, food, technology, environment, whatever, but not as Moore says, not by equating them with each other exactly. And of course, we have a traditional labor theory of value that classical economists basically say that things have value. Things have the value equal to the amount of labor that is embodied in each commodity or the amount of labor that needs to be produced at the current historical technological development and skill level. But not everything is useful for a type. Not every value theory is useful or at least substantial for a type 1 future. For instance, the energy theory of value fails to capture a typical phenomenon. For instance, Stalin, a physicist, most energy value theories are physicists or STEM scientists say, come on, an average human needs 3,000 calories per day, but only 1 fraction goes to work. You don't work the rest every hour of your day. But they fail to capture that way much higher energy is produced per worker than the 3,000 calories they consume. Or Moore's law of cheap nature. As I said, the problem is equate labor with the means and the objects of labor, attributing productiveness to the last two. So you cannot necessarily have an analysis that describes capitalism or even be useful to socialism, or it might be useful to socialism under certain conditions. I said the word socialism. It was a spoiler. And you have the energy theory of value that even econophysicists have proven it by using the method of statistical mechanics. They have proven that actually it proves the labor theory of value. Statistical mechanics of the analysis of capitalism prove that labor theory of value is valid. Basically, it describes how economy is measured and should be measured. And even Cockshott himself did some calculations, and he found only a tiny amount of commodities that is not described by the wage variations or labor theory value in a very, very crude form, though. So what kind of economic problem? Definitely not the energy theory of value on its own. Definitely not Moore's economic laws on their own. Labor theory of value, yeah, let's discuss this. How did we reach that point that humans consume only 3,000 calories, but energy production per human is way higher than this? And Adam Smith has already given this answer through the pin factory example, when he said that one human can produce 20 pins per day, but 40 humans don't produce only 800 pins per day. They produce 4,000 by the example when he noticed what's going on in the pin factory. And these are the benefits of the division of labor. So basically, division of labor is a social sciences variable that is not included by energy theory of value or other sort of pure scientific analysis. So division of labor captures the collective workers' productivity that is far superior to all workers separately. And this shows that we cannot reduce one level of matter more complex to a least complex. So you cannot reduce the sociological matter to purely energy, physics, and biology. And therefore, we propose that if this is what the division of labor does under capitalism, imagine under a globalized economy without the obstacles of competition and the waste of resources. So basically in a type 1 future. James, the floor is yours.
Right, thanks. So the third contradiction has to do with it's a global capitalist type 1 civilization and how technologies would get used therein. Most of the futurist discourse sort of imagines a linear or an internal logic for technological development where, similar to the logic of trickle-down economics, that once the technology gets invented, eventually the technologies will trickle down to everybody. And that's what you would need for this globalized capitalist civilization, right? The example of cell phones is often used here, right? Where now, I don't know what the exact numbers are, I forgot to include that on the slide, but there's something, 80% of the world's population has access to a cell phone now or something. It's quite high, it's quite a shocking number. Even in places where people are living in extreme poverty, they often have access to maybe a shared cell phone or something. But that doesn't tell the full story of how the relations in a capitalist society actually guide how technology is developed and how it gets deployed. And there's a lot of ways we could talk about this, a lot of specific examples, but the big one would obviously be commodification, which has massive effects on what happens with technology. The first of these that everyone is probably aware of is planned obsolescence, but it's quite significant. Cars are made to die in 10 years, more or less, at least in North America, where I'm from. And phones are made to die even faster, right? There's good evidence there's proof that they planned this with phones. Apple's basically caught admitting to making certain components self-destruct, so you can sell more units. This has implications for a type 1 civilization because planned obsolescence leads to waste, obviously. And next slide, please. And when you only have one planet, waste has to go somewhere, and it follows the existing hierarchy of the global capitalist economy, where waste gets shipped to the poor places from North America, Western Europe, to the periphery. Now, for a globalized capitalist civilization, this might be an obstacle to having that global civilization, because you're going to have a very powerful, technologically advanced society producing more computer waste theoretically, and somebody's going to have to live among all that waste. Next slide, please. Now, the differential treatment of different areas of the world by capitalist production not only manifests in terms of waste, but it's also interestingly forming the technological backbone of the data-intensive economy, a data-intensive technology generally. So as you may know, machine learning, which is the sort of new infrastructure of the digital world, relies on training data, right? Models are produced by extracting patterns from training data, but data sets are not, they don't exist in the wild. Somebody has to create them, and as the more sophisticated technology gets, the bigger these have to be. And there's a lot of problems with creating them. And so people use the data sets that are already produced, and you can only produce them when there is data. So this map here, it distorts the land masses on the basis of how much or how many data sets, important machine learning data sets, are derived from those regions. And you can see that North America is the biggest source of these, with other parts of the richer parts of the world being more well represented. But Africa, for instance, and South America are not very well represented here. So the algorithms that are automating all kinds of social processes, technological applications here are coming from certain parts of the world and are representing the patterns of life and people's behavior in those regions, not others. So again, we have of trouble for a global civilization which builds its machines to represent only a small subset of the global population. This very cool animation tracks GDP in relation to publications, AI publications. And the AI industry is sort of my main research topic, so I find this especially interesting. But unsurprisingly, the USA leads here. But if you listen to the discourse of people such as World Economic Forum and the tech industry broadly, there's all this discourse about the democratization of AI. And what that really means is getting access to Google Clouds and cloud computing platforms through some form of API. But that doesn't translate into wealth for the regions that can access that. That is retained by wherever the companies that produce that platform exist, i.e. the US predominantly. Yes, so again, we have uneven development in terms of technology. So on the basis of some sort of similar logic to this, Paul Cockshott has argued that this is the reason why we don't have thermonuclear power like the tokamak model, nor orbiting solar power stations, which he argues are the most probably effective, efficient, and ecologically sound techniques for generating massive amounts of energy, because the fixed capital is just too much for capitalist organizations to undertake. And in fact, the tokamak, the only real attempt at building a full tokamak reactor was begun by the USSR and is being carried on by an international consortium right now. So from these we can extrapolate trouble for a type 1 civilization.
Yep, thank you. For type 1 civilization in capitalism, So now what's the solution? How, if we have convinced you already that, yeah, let's go for a type 1, but no capitalist, what kind of? That's the biggest question. And even if we agree on both type 1 and on anti-capitalist future, how would be that future then? And here is where the most disagreement, most arguments will take place, because you have 2 anti-capitalists and 3 opinions. So how would that post-capitalist, anti-capitalist, whatever future would look like? Cockshott has also provided an interesting contribution there by saying that it's not what we want roughly, but what we need. So we are not utopians. It's not that I convince James and we convince you and we all convince everyone else for this type 1 future. It's not voluntaristic, this experiment. So even if we even if we convince you, still this future will not take place because it will not be materialistic. What do we mean? So what distinguishes a utopian from materialistic is that the latter, the materialistic, starts with the real contradictions that exist in the previous system. So we don't start imagine and propose what we imagine would be amazing, but how to solve the solution. The new system lies underneath the solutions to resolve the contradictions of the previous system, basically. So the real contradictions of the previous system assign us to move to the new system, will lead us, will determine how the new system will look like. And we identify basically 3 kind of solution, 3 dimensions to the solution. We agree on planning, first of all, no on markets, and of course on the abolishment of private ownership. I repeat, no my toothbrush, no my bed, no my car, but the concentrated means of production. So one thing we have to discuss is one thing that we find necessary for us to move to type 1 civilization is the means of production have to be socialized or collectivized, depending on the area, the problem we have at the time. Another dimension is that there has to be some sort of central planning, not in the sense of a dictator that will do whatever they want, but in the sense of a democratically controlled central planning, because you need central planning to take resources from one part of the planet to move them to the other, or to resolve these grandiose problems. And of course, it will be, if it's not democratic, then it will not be a nice future. So here we add the dimension of democracy, but not only democracy, because democracy can be manipulated, but also isigoria, which is an ancient Greek concept as well. I can explain later. So 3 dimensions: socialized, central, and democratic / isigoric control for us to move to this type 1 civilization. First of all, what does this mean, socialized or collectivized? Again, we invite you for contributions here, or whoever is interested, that post-capitalists do not agree what would be the economic calculation of the next economic system. There are Austrian economists with, like Hayek, discussing the impossibility of socialist calculation based on the paradox of knowledge theory they have. Or Castoriadis himself, he basically said there will be no capitalism, no socialism. It will be just through technology. We will just reach some sort of post-scarcity utopia. Cockshott, with his new socialism, he became more specific by saying there will be ecological and technological constraints, planning based on the socially necessary labor time. This means, for the economists that are here, linear programming with a lot of constraints. Ecological, this is the amount of CO2 emissions we should have, or this is the biodiversity the biodiversity level we should preserve. The technology should have this kind of energy consumption or configuration, etc., etc. So it looks like linear programming. Of course, I've talked to physicists. They said there are better tools than linear programming. We will have them hopefully in this future with them to advise us. But yeah, so far I'm more familiar with the linear programming. And you have Albert and Hanel proposing the parecon or participatory economics that sound more cool, but digging a bit deeper into them, you realize how much they resemble neoclassical economics in the methodology. Basically, they accept a lot of arbitrary assumptions of the neoclassical economics too. We can also go further. And we have Fraser that says, even if we reach post-scarcity economy, this is a cool graph from an artist describing the post-scarcity economy. Even if we reach a post-scarcity economy, we will still need planning to sort out the issues of the lot, the abundance issues. So even if we have superabundance, okay, we'll ever have abundance. We can, if I have a replicator to order, I want a burger, they can make me a burger, fair enough. But if I order to make them a mass shooting gun, will I be allowed to do that? So we will still need planning even for the issues of post-scarcity. Now, okay, we agreed on that, let's say, but how are we going to do it? Are we going to be central or decentralized planning? In history of humanity, they have been both, especially in the 20th century. We have some sort of central planning and coordination, but even in capitalism, so like Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, they basically ordered their industrialists to stop competing with each other and listen to the economic planner and massively kill people and massively attack the rest of Europe, etc., etc. So is this what we propose? Of course, the answer is no. China, could someone say, they have central planning, but without the democratic and the socialized means of production. So also, it's not what we imagine as well either. So a democratic, but on the other hand, we have seen democratic, but not centrally planned, like post-bankruptcy Argentinian anarcho-syndicalism, where they occupied bankrupt businesses, Yugoslavian autonomism with Tito, post-60s, the Soviet Union after the 60s, that became more decentralized, more resembling market, and the Chilean project CyberSyn. This is the room, the CyberSyn room from Chile. We had actually one of the people who contributed to the project eventually became an academic in Aston University in my department, operational research. Quite cool. I learned it last year. Fun fact. Yeah, so basically we need to discuss these things, and we need to think that you have democratic but not centrally planned, so a democratically elected plan that technology right now can facilitate, right? We vote for the next X Factor star, right? Not me. I don't know. Hopefully not you either. But the point is, you can vote for instant decisions nowadays. So we have the technology to do democracy, and then the outcome to be centrally distributed downwards. And of course, the new concept here that we learned with our paper, and we haven't seen anyone else doing it, but if you know any literature, please let us know, is that we don't just argue in favor of democracy, but of isigoria. Isigoria means isi, agora, equal speech. Basically, democracy a lot of times is usually through the representative democracy. So you have to elect someone to represent you somehow. So it involves hierarchies of some sort, or stronger hierarchies. And Aristotle, he was very against democracy because he thought that this can be easily manipulated by the rich people that can speak and can manipulate the masses. And he was right. Look at the parties that we elect. They're, especially in Britain, they all come from Oxbridge. They know how to speak or whatever. There are certain hierarchies where democracy can be manipulated. So we propose the even more progressive concept of isigoria, where everyone has an equal turn. In universities, we can understand this, especially those of us that have studied in universities in Europe, that the head of the department is someone, from us. And every couple of years this changes. So everyone has their turn, let's say, in terms of running the business, and it's not management, it's just organization and running the processes. So this is the concept we add the isigoria. And the other dimension we add is Cockshott and Contrell's point that there might be a contradiction between central planning and democratic control. So the central planners, they might have a bit more concentrated power and might try to manipulate the masses, and the masses might have an aversion to the central planners. But the only country we know this existed was Soviet Union, and they never acknowledged this as a contradiction. So here we agree, or we resonate kind of with Cockshott and Cottrell, that this might be an issue in the next system, however this looks like. So that's our presentation. Okay, only 1 hour. So we have 30 minutes for
50 minutes. 50
questions.
minutes.
So thank you. I can leave it here. I can stop presenting. It's up to you. I'll stop presenting. But yeah, I'll stop presenting after saying type 1. Socialism is basically what we propose. Technology, ecology, political economy, post-scarcity at some point. But scientific, democratic, calculated with councils, planetary planning, isogoric with peoples, and automated in situations it has to be. That's all.
I would like to say first thanks. I thought the presentation in terms of the way you set it up, it's beautiful. The graphics, the effort of the presentation style was very nice in itself. So thanks for that. I haven't seen such a nice presentation in a long time. Anybody have any comments? Questions?
Just to add, this is the beginning of a project. So we didn't do any primary research ourselves. So it's basically the structure, the skeleton of what we envisage as a bigger project. So be our guests with comments and questions.
Yes, I'll just say quickly that the project is a strange project insofar as it attempts to use historical materialism to do futurism, which might sound like a paradox in terms. But anyways, that's the goal.